Welcome to our shir, Parshas Shoftim, Tafshin Pei, and we make today's shir L'Zech Nishmas Mori Rabbi Rabbi Chaim Dov, Rabbi Yaakov Koppel Halevi Keller, the Tel Chicago Rosh Hashiva, who I had the schus to learn by for many years throughout high school and a little bit of Beis Medrash. And I asked him many shilas. He was a source of great hadracha for me, and really my Weltanschauung in Hashkafas HaTorah really very much comes from him. And the Mitzvah Hashem will tell over a little story as the shir progresses. But first I'd like to mention something that we said last week. We talked about the topic of Rabbi, of seeing things and how they make a rosham on us and they can change us. And we mentioned a story from the Vilna Gaon that Rabbi Vigda Miller told, that when he was a little boy, his grandmother was in her 90s, and she heard from her grandmother, who was in her 90s when she was a little girl, that in the time of the Vilna Gaon, the women used to go and stand on the riverbanks to see when the Vilna Gaon would go by. There was a bridge, and they had these wooden slats, and there was in between you could see, and they would go to look at the Vilna Gaon. So when they were expecting, in order that their child should look like the Vilna Gaon. So that was something that, and I mentioned this over by my Shabbos table, and interestingly, my daughter-in-law Zolzain Gesund said that she was in Bnei Brak last year, and there was an hug of the women there too, is that the women used to go, when Reb Chaim Kanievsky walks on the little bridge between his home and the shul, the Letterman shul, so all the women who are expecting line up so they can see the gadol. So I was saying that I'm telling a story from 200 years ago, and even today, Baruch Hashem, the Noshim Tzidkanius and Klal Yisrael understand these things instinctively, and then they wanted their children to grow up to be Gedolei Yisrael, so they realize by interacting, seeing Gedolei Yisrael, that they can make a tremendous rosham on their children, and Yetz Hashem, they'll all become Gedolei Yisrael themselves. Shoftim v'shaitim tidlu chol sharecha. So this Sedra is sort of, we get down to business. We want to talk about, we're coming to Eretz Yisrael, and now we need to set up a system whereby people can learn, people can be judged, people can have the systems that you need in order to run an ummah. And it should be proper. Shoftim v'shaitim tidlu chol sharecha, asher Hashem lekach noisen l'cha, that Hashem is going to give you. It's not just you're making a system of laws, right, that Ben Franklin thought up, or Jefferson, Madison, but something that Torah Hashem is giving you. It's a perfect law, and they're going to interpret it. And they will all judge the nation. And it tells us, lo sata mishpat, you shouldn't pervert the mishpat. Lo sakir ponim, you shouldn't take one side over the other. Lo sika shoich, and of course we know the biggie, shouldn't take any shoicha, chas v'sholom. And here, interesting enough, the Torah gives us a whole reason for it. In other words, we would think instinctively, no, you can't take shoichad. So why does the Torah tell us this? And because it can knock off tzaddikim and so on. What's the purpose of that? And the answer is that there's two types of shoichad. There's a shoichad that we know. Someone walks over and says, here's $5, throw the game, throw the mishpat. But there's the much more subtle type of mishpat. There's a much more subtle type of shaychad. The shaychad that we don't even realize is coming. There's a famous story of Rabbi Premishlan, that one time, I think it's Rabbi, that one time somebody put money into his pocket, slipped into his pocket. And then when they made the din, he felt like, I just feel like for that person. They couldn't figure it out. Why would I feel like for one person more than the other? And then he put his hand into his pocket and he saw the money and he realized what had happened. So there's a shaykhah that we don't even realize. Somebody gave you shaykhah by smiling at you, by saying good morning to you. That's why the minhag used to be by Dayanim, they wear a talis ibn cup, so that they shouldn't be able to see who's judging. Right? We never allow one person to stand, one person to sit. Everybody has to come in front of the Dayanim equal. Otherwise, the shaykhah just by who they are. If a Gadol Hador is having a din with somebody, so you know this one's Gadol Hador right away, it's hard. So the Torah says, even Chachamim, even Tzaddikim, you got to be careful. That's the way people are. And then we go on and talk about it further, and we say the time will come when you're going to have kipolim imcha davar lamishpat bein dam ladam bein din ladin bein negel neged divi riz b'sharach. You're going to have disputes. What do you do when you have a dispute? What do you do? So the Torah gives us a very clear answer. When come to Valisa Elamakim, you should go to the place Asher Yivcha Hashem Lekecha, by that Hashem chose. Uvas el kahanim alevim vel hashayva sheyeh b'yomim meheim v'derashta, and they're going to tell you what to do. They're going to tell you what to do. So we see that we go to our Gedolei Yisrael, and that when there's a problem, you go to the Dayanim, you go to the Bezdin. The famous story that we've told many times, Rabbi Reisen tells over, somebody once took Rapam to a Din Torah, and the yeshiva was outraged, and they wanted to write a pashkavil against this person. How do you go against Gadol Ador? Take him to Din Torah, chutzpah. And Rapam laughed. He said, what? Of course we should go to Din Torah. He says the whole purpose of a Din Torah is to make shalom between people. The whole purpose is not to make a fight, is that they should go to the mishpat, and they should figure it out. That's why you have a Din Torah. That's the purpose. So it's there. It's a way of making shalom between people, not chas v'shalom fights. They say that the person who loses the Din Torah should jump out happy, should be shouting with joy. Baruch Hashem, I didn't have gazelle in my hand. Unfortunately, people see Din Torah in a very different light today. But the Torah's idea of Din Torah is to bring everybody together, b'shalom, b'shalva. So we're talking about Rav Keller. We talk about the Das Torah that we have. So I'd like to share a story that happened when I was a Becker. I was about 16 years old. And I went to the Rosh Yeshiva. And at that time, to give some historical background, the French were selling, most of the Air Force of the Israeli Air Force came from French selling what's called Mirage jets, a certain type of jet. And at that point in history, the French were upset with the Jews for winning the war, the 67 war. This was in 1970. This happened. They didn't want to give them the jets anymore. They wanted to stop selling them the jets. And there was a big tumult in the Welt, because this was what's going to be with the Israeli Air Force, well, to defend themselves. So the Prime Minister of France, his name was George Pompidou, and he came to Chicago to give a speech or negotiate, whatever he was in Chicago for some reason, and I was a Becker. And the Jewish community in Chicago decided we're going to go and we're going to protest. A chutzpah, Pompidou. We're going to protest against him. He should change his mind. And they invited everybody to participate. And of course, the yeshiva wasn't going to participate. We don't believe in demonstrations. We're not going. The Frum Ilam doesn't believe in demonstrations. Not going. And I was a very idealistic and what should I say, naive Becker. And I felt it's not right if the whole community is doing it. We should be part of it, and so on. So I went to the Rav Shiva, Rav Keller, and I said, Rabbi, why isn't the yeshiva participating? We should all be going to, And he said, you never know what will happen. It's not the right thing to go. But he said, but if you want to go, I'm not going to stop you. You can go. So I went. So I come downtown to the hotel. It was the Palmer Hotel, maybe. And there's hundreds of people, and they're all demonstrating, they're all yelling, boo, boo, Pompidou, boo, boo, Pompidou, sell the jets. And it was a whole raucous demonstration, and Pompidou gets out of the black limousine, and he walks into the hotel. And this is my recollection. As he walking into the hotel, someone broke out of the crowd and ran over and spit on him. And he became so enraged and so angry, he said, I will never sell jets to Israel. This is the kind of people they are. Forget about it. Never. And they didn't. And I learned an immense lesson. Went back to Rosh Shiva, said, this is Das Torah. And this is what happens when we started with Das Torah. I learned a tremendous lesson. First, I learned how in a demonstration, and you never know what's going to happen because it gets out of control. People can do, one person, you have a demonstration with 1,000 people, and one person does something narsh, and you never know what's going to be, and how careful you have to be. But I learned also who you go with, who's speaking, who's demonstrating, there's a Torah look on everything. And that's what Rav Keller was. He was the quintessential Baal Hashkafa. He wrote many articles in the Jewish Observer that gave over Hashkafa to all of Klal Yisrael. He was Mamash a Baal Machshava, tremendous Baal Machshava. And he gave it over in a beautiful way. He was a tremendous orator. He spoke many times at a good of conventions, and he spoke. It was like amazing. He gave over Das Torah. He managed every word he said. It was something to behold. In Baruch Hashem, we were zoicha. I remember I once asked him that why is it that we find there's certain negunim that we sing, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that really seem to have a secular source. I mean, they seem to be. How do we start seeing that? It's famous as that the Shir Amalis, which is the Napoleon's March. How did that happen? I mean, it isn't from a non. So he said that niggin song is neutral, like everything else. There's kaichas atuma in it, there's kaichas atar in it, and we can take out the kaicha atar in it, and we can use it for tahara, and that's true of everything, even kas. Every meeting, you think kas is the worst. Okay, but when a child runs into the street, you better show him some kas, so he won't do it again. You're saving his life by showing him kas. Everything, kinna, jealousy, bad mida. No, kinna start from tar b'chachma. If it's put in the right place, it can. Without kinna, we get nowhere. Taiva, terrible. Without taiva, there would be no world. Azezal Chazal. So I learned so much from the Rabbi, and it's talking a Veda for all of Klal Yisrael. They put out he has a sefer called Chidekel, Chaim Doiv, I guess couple Levi, I guess that's Chidekel, and which much of it is covered there. I hope they'll be mefarsim it, so the whole world can learn from that hashkafa. It'll translate to English. So schusa yagan aleinu. So I'd also like to mention, we were talking about Gedolei Yisrael, mentioned Rapam before. So I heard Reisen mentioned by Rapam by Pelegish Begiva. It says that the Rebbeinu Shem said, the Pelegish Begiva, we know that they all went out against them. They made a whole against Shevet Binyamin. So the Rebbeinu Shem says, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Kuf Gimel, that he says, Al Kvoid Basar B'Dam, on the cover of Basar B'Dam, Machisa, that you made a Machah. Al Kvoid Diloi Machisa, my cover not. So the problem sounds like the bunch of Chassidus like jealous, like the boss of Dam, yes. He said, no, that's not the pshat. He said, if you had taken my covet seriously, and this is what it says, that if it would be, you'd listen to the Rebbeinu Shalom, that the Rebbeinu Shem's giving over tells you how to be mechanech, and you'd have a proper chinuch from the beginning. From day one, there would be a proper chinuch. You wouldn't have this problem years later. If there had been a proper chinuch, the Maisa Pelegish never would have happened. So you take a look at something, and you go back 50 years, and you say, you know what happened today? Everything that happened today is because of what happened 50 years ago, 25 years ago. Because that person who did this terrible Maisa, the Pelegish Begiva, these people, the B'nai Blial, who did the Maisa Pelegish Begiva, obviously something was wrong with their chinuch. So that's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu meant. On the COVID, on Basar B'Dam, now you're upset. If you had been upset 25 years ago, they weren't getting proper chinuch, then something could have happened properly. So it's all in the beginning. It's all how we start. It's all in Shoftim, V'shaitin, Titin, Lecha, V'chol. Right now, you've got to get those Shoftim. And that will preclude later on. We're going to have Kamtava Lisa, you're going to have Dinei Torah, you're going to have problems. Because they were taught properly. They were taught how to resolve differences, how to resolve things. If people would learn how to resolve them initially, they wouldn't have so much problems later on. We talked about Divrei Ribais B'Sharecha. Talked about disputes. And unfortunately, there have been disputes throughout history. And some of them have been very bitter disputes. And one of the disputes is the dispute of Kairach. And we know last week's in the Pirkei Avos, we had that, Kol Machlokes Shem Shemaim, Soif Liskayin, that's Hil V'Shamai, Machlokes She'eino L'Shem Shemaim, Eino Soif Liskayin, that's Kairach V'Adasai. And we talk about Kairach, and we talk about the fight and the machlokes that he generated. and he's condemned in history. But on the other hand, it's very interesting. We name a Parsha after him. That's interesting. Kairach? A Parsha? So some of the Rebbes used to say the Heilig Zayda Kairach, that said Tzadik Katamer Yifrach is Reish Seifi Tevis Kairach. Because Kairach in the future would be Taka get a stellar, Taka be kind gadol. Kairach was not Pashut. So what happened? How did he get into such a machlokes? How did he fall into this? So Rashi says a pshat because he was niskana, because he had kinna. But maybe there's something that made it happen as well. There's a famous Gemara in the stories of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. So Rabbi Bar Bar Chana was an Amar who had amazing stories. There's the whole system of Gemara's Rabbi Bar Chana. Rav Aaron Feldman Shlita, Rav Shimon Ner Yisrael wrote a brilliant sefer on the juggler and the king, and he has all different interesting mices, and each one teaches a profound lesson. So one of the stories, it's Gemara in Bava Basra Ayin Daled and also in Sanhedrin, Kuf Yud. So Gemara says like this: Rabbi Bar Chana says, I was walking on the way, and I saw an Arab trader was giving me, showing me around. He was giving me a tour, and he said to him, "Ta achvilach, I will show you blue de kairach. I will show you the people who were swallowed up by kairach." And he shows him. He says, "Ozel, chazi." He saw Trey busy. He saw 2 cracks in the ground, and from the cracks, he says, were coming out smoke. And the trader took some wool on a stick, he put water on it, put it into the ground, and got singed. So the shaila is, and the rest of the story was, he says, listen to the ground. So they listened into the ground, and it says, Maisha emes, v'sayraso emes, v'heim badoyim. It says, he said the trader, if you go once a month, you'll hear voices coming out from the ground, saying Maish is true, his Torah is true, and they are fakers. And Pshat is Hein Badai means you don't want to say, and we are fakers. You don't want to talk about yourself like that. So you make it sound like it's somebody else. Hein Badai. It's called Lashon Nikiya. So the Sefer Nishbal Avasecha from Reb Tzvi Baruch HaKayin Moshkevitz of the city of Fuchs, and later in Borough Park. So he says a Pshat. He says, what's Pshat? There were 2 cracks in the ground. What are these 2 cracks in the ground with fire coming out of it? So he says that represents the Mecharkerei Riv, the people who pushed the Machlokes, the agitators, who made the Machlokes so bitter. You know what their names were? Dasim Vaviram, the ones who made trouble all along. So he says they're the ones who agitated Kairach, who pushed Kairach, who stood behind Kairach. Kairach by himself would not have been able to do it. You need people. To make a rebellion, you can't just get up there and say, I'm making a rebellion. It's not going to work. You have to have troops. You have to have people. So he got Ruvain, he got the 250, Rosh, he got people behind him. But Chazal tell us that the 2 people who were the agitators, who were the ones who really made it happen, were Das and Vavira. So he says that's Pshat in the 2 cracks in the ground that the fire's coming out of. You want to see, he says the Arab trader, and he says that doesn't mean Arab trader, it means it was a Talmud Chacham who knew a lot. So he says those 2 cracks in the ground represent, and fire coming, they represent the agitators, the people who make a machlokes happen, the people sizant machlokes, the little people that take the person, the leader. In other words, they're like the campaign manager. He's the one running for president, and they're the campaign managers, right? So they're the ones who agitate. His job is to be the head, and their job is to be the head. He's the candidate, and they're the agitators. They're the staff. So Dasav Avir with the 2 cracks, and there's fire coming out, because they were causing the fire of Machlokes. They were the ones behind it. And he says, and that's shot in the Pasuk. The Pasuk tells us very much so, that we find by Dasav Aviram. So the Parshas Pinchas, when it talks about Dasav Aviram, It says, "Who does vavirim? There does vavirim kruya eda, asher hitzu al Moshe vel Aaron." That they agitated against Moshe vel Aaron, ba'das kairach, with the aid of kairach. And then it continues the pasuk. Batsoisim, it says again, Batsoisim al Hashem, they agitated against Hashem. Vatiftach ha'aretz is piyah. The ground opens up its mouth. Vativla oisam ve'es kairach, and swallows them up, and kairach, because kairach was not schlepping to them. They were the main forces behind it, and therefore kairach was mentioned almost incidentally. And as a matter of fact, when in Parshas Pinchas, who mentions kairach, it doesn't say anything, just says kairach. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu went after the Dasan Vavira, because Dasan Vavira were the agitators. They're the ones behind it. And he says that's shot in what they said while down there. He said, I'm going to show you Blui the Kairach, I'm going to show you the people buried in the ground, and you'll hear kairach, they're down there. And you hear them saying, Ma'isha emes aras emes v'hei badoyim. He says v'hei meaning kairach das vaviram, not as Pshat is v'hei meaning themselves, but v'hei das vaviram badoyim. They're the fakers who got us, who agitated, who made this happen. Rahman al-Islam, we find there was a famous machlokes, a Veltz machlokes, between great Gedolei Yisrael, Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonasan Eibschutz. And if you learn the history of that machlokes, it was so much the Mecharkarei Riv, the little people behind it, who calls the machlokes. Even today, and we won't mention any specifics, but we all know that there's certain machlokes amongst Gedolei Yisrael, which then the Gedolei Yisrael. But unfortunately, there are people who turn it into something more than a machlokes and hashkafa. They turn it into something not geschmack. So that's when it says in the Mishnah that it says in the Mishnah, machlokes shein l'shayin kairach v'adasai. And the old catch is, when you say kairach Moshe, so Parshas we don't mention Moshe with kairach in the same breath, right? Just like Yaakov didn't want to mention him in the same breath. So we only misach them back to Levi, not back to Yaakov. So in the same way, it was kairach, but v'adasu, because without the adasu, there could not have been a machlokes shel Hashem. Kairach himself couldn't have pulled it off. He needed the adasu, and unfortunately, it was the Mecharkarei Riv, and that's something we have to be so careful of. That sometimes, things come up in shul, they come up in the community, and we're outraged and we're upset. And this, sit back a second, be very careful. Only have, as we said before, we talked about Das Torah. Go to Das Torah, find out, should I be involved, should I not be involved? Don't express our own opinions. We're not Gedolei Yisrael. We need Gedolei Yisrael. We need Rabbanim. They will teach us the way. And that's what the Torah tells us. When you have Divrei Ribos Misharecha, so Pshat, you have disputes. You have disputes between different people. Sometimes you have dispute within yourself that you don't know how to go. Should I go on this side? Should I go on that side? And the Torah tells you, go to the Khan, to Levium, to the Shoftim, and they'll guide you. We need a little humility. We need a little bit to say, maybe I'm not the big Bal Hashkafa Baldeya that I think I am, and right away get involved in a machlokes chas v'shalom, right away get involved in whatever it is. We have to go very carefully, because that's the most detrimental thing that can happen to Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu, who was so gentle and so kind, but when it came to kairach, he was like a lion, because it wasn't his covet, it wasn't him, right? We said before that he was the Mo'anim Mikol Adam, but he understood that Klal Yisrael was under attack, and the very essence of Klal Yisrael, the very essence of Shoftim v'Shoftim l'cha b'chol sharecha was under attack. So that's something he has to do. So we learn a tremendous lesson. We learn how careful we have to be to listen to our Gedolei Yisrael, to follow them. We have to be careful never to chas v'shalom get involved in a machlokes. We have to know that we have to have a chinuch that at the beginning takes us where we need to be, and when we are there, we're going to be able to get to where there won't come years later that we'll regret it and have such magos. Hashem should guard us, hold us with time of El, just Rosh Chodesh El. Today is Rosh Chodesh El. We're mitzitat from the Yom Hadin, and one of the best ways that we can do tshuva is by being b'shalom with everybody. And if we're b'shalom with everybody, and we love each other, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will love us as well. So I'll have a good Shabbos, and Mir Hashem will continue to talk about El and the Yom Narayim and the Heilig Yantav Sukkot as we get closer. Call to and have a good Shabbos.